As expected, very few genuinely new parts arrived at the Australian Grand Prix, as the 10 Formula 1 teams wanted to put more mileage on the packages they ran with in Bahrain testing. That's not to say anyone didn't dabble in a bit of early update fun. Sauber introduced a new set of wings for the opening race, McLaren had a circuit-specific set of rear wings to test, and Red Bull spent the weekend with differing nose concepts, as it had done on the final day in Bahrain. But we also had some fallout from the weekend, as the FIA chose to tighten up its regulations on rear wing flexing even further, despite having introduced more stringent tests for Melbourne. Let's take a look at everything we learned in Australia, and look ahead to what we expect in China. The MCL39 has produced envious glances from rival teams, but McLaren has not taken anything for granted. Last year, the team shuffled through numerous rear-wing packages in order to balance the car for a range of venues, and it has continued upon that trajectory. In Melbourne, McLaren had both a standard 2-element single beam wing and a split double beam wing, with the second part of the wing mounted further up, to compare and contrast. The standard beam wing formed part of a higher downforce wing that McLaren had run throughout Bahrain testing. The double beam setup formed part of the lower range downforce wing run in an FP1 trial. The high downforce wing was used throughout the duration of the weekend, although it is unlikely that the lower downforce variant was ever in consideration for Melbourne. It's possible that this might be explored further in China to see if the car can benefit from the greater straight line efficiency along Shanghai's 1.2 km back straight. Running a double beam wing with the lower downforce wing geometry effectively redistributes some of the load generation further down, linking up with the diffuser, but this also produces less drag overall. Max Verstappen and Liam Lawson ran to slightly different specifications over the Australia weekend, with Verstappen running the shorter, wider nose and a different floor that the team had explored on its RB21 in the final day of Bahrain testing. Lawson, by contrast, appeared to use the specification that the team began the test with, retaining the longer nose. This was part of Red Bull's continued exploration of how to get the most out of its package, as it missed out on implementing a race-style run in testing due to a series of teething problems in Bahrain. Christian Horner explained that the team wanted to go to extremes to understand its setup window, and feels that it has a much better platform with the RB21 compared to last year's car. The indications are that the RB21's outright performance ceiling is a little bit lower than the RB20's, but the car is much more benign than last year's and should theoretically be easier to work with. A new front and rear wing helped Sauber find some progression from testing, which allowed it to break into Q2 courtesy of Gabriel Bortoletto's last-ditch effort to bump Andrea Kimi Antonelli from the top 15. The team had briefly trialled the new front wing in testing in Bahrain, but it was given a proper run in Australia as the team switched to a more conventional inboard-loaded wing. This means that the part of the wing closest to the junction to the nose is responsible for generating most of the downforce. This contrasts to an outboard-loaded wing, where the centre to outside span of each side generates the bulk of the front-end load. The team also had a higher downforce rear wing in Melbourne, complete with a straight trailing edge and more camber in the main plane. Technical director James Key reckoned that the new wings had done their job, but the team could have taken another step with optimising the car setup around them. Even after tightening up the rear wing load tests for the Australian Grand Prix, the FIA is imposing stricter tests for F1 rear wings at this weekend's Chinese Grand Prix after analysing Melbourne footage. Having further studied the findings from the Melbourne weekend, the FIA has decided to tighten up the rear wing rules for China, as it felt teams could still exploit wing flexing more than intended. The rules will reduce the maximum slot gap width between the main plane and the rear wing flap from 2mm to 0.5mm, when subjected to 75 kg of vertical load. Due to the short notice for Shanghai, a tolerance of 0.25mm will be added to this new limit. The FIA said all teams were informed on Monday morning of the decision to revise its technical directive, and stressed that all cars were found to be legal over the Australian Grand Prix weekend. Increased flex tests for the front wings will not be brought into effect until the Spanish Grand Prix in June.